Hello everyone and welcome to Chess Vibe, and today I'm going to show you a very interesting game between Magnus Carlsen versus Jan-Krzysztof Duda, and the game is from the FIDE World Cup 2021 and this is the semi-final. So in semi-final, obviously the FIDE World Cup tournament is going to be held in classical variation. So both the games went draw between Magnus Carlsen and Jan-Krzysztof Duda. So the game went into the playoff section, and in the playoff section there would be two rapid games. So the game I'm going to show you right now is the second game from the rapid section. The first game of the rapid section went drawn. So obviously the second game of the rapid section that I'm going to show you, whosoever will win will qualify for the final to fight against Sergey Karyakin, and the player who will lose will get eliminated. So the game is between Magnus Carlsen and Jan-Krzysztof Duda, so obviously the game is going to be very interesting. So till then, stay tuned and keep watching Chess Vibes. So Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces and Jan-Krzysztof Duda with the black pieces. So let's see what happened in the game. So Magnus Carlsen started with 1 e4 and Jan-Krzysztof Duda replied with c5. So we have the Sicilian defense on the board, and playing Sicilian defense is a very aggressive opening and very attacking opening for black as well. So obviously both sides wants to win, so obviously both players are going to play an attacking chess. So after c5 we have knight to f3 by Magnus, d6 by Duda, bishop to b5 check, we have bishop d7. Playing knight to d7 is also a line in which black plays a6 on the next move and asks the white bishop on b5 whether he wants to grab the knight on d7 or whether he wants to go back to e2. But okay, we have bishop d7, perfectly fine. We have a bishop trade and queen captured the bishop on d7. We have castle by white, knight developed to f6, queen to e2 by white, protecting the pawn on e4. We have knight to c6 by black, c3 by white, stopping these ideas of knight to d4 and also preparing to play d4 in the future. So after c3 we have e6 by black, preparing to play bishop e7 followed by castle. After e6 we have d4 by white, so white is having a very nice center. We have cd4, cd4, and now we have d5 by black. So after playing d5, white is having options. He can grab the pawn on d5, he can push the pawn to e5, or he can develop something like knight to c3. But in the game we have e5 by white, definitely a fine move, most natural move. White is having a large amount of center, and the pawn on e5 is now attacking the knight on f6. We have knight to e4 by black, knight to d2 by white, asking for a knight trade. Obviously black would trade the knight because the knight on e4 was not having any squares. So we have a knight trade, and now we have bishop to b4 by black, asking for a bishop trade with a tempo, and now black is ready for castle. Here white played bishop f4, not going to trade the bishops. We have castle by black, queen to d3 by white, perhaps giving some support to the pawn on d4. We have bishop back to e7, perhaps black wants to break with f6 at some point. So after bishop e7 we have a3 by white, stopping these nasty ideas of knight to b4. We have rook c8 by black, g3 by white, protecting the bishop on f4 and also giving a square to the king on g2 so that there would be no back rank mates in the future. After g3 we have knight to a5 by black. The idea of playing knight to a5 is now the knight on a5 wants to come on c4, and it would be the best square for the knight. So after knight a5, white simply stopped this idea of coming to c5 by playing b3. We have queen to c6, bishop comes to d2 attacking the knight on a5. We have queen b6 by black. Now knight and the queen on b6 is attacking the pawn on b3. So white simply played rook b1 and just protecting both the pawns. So now we have a6 by black. We have king to g2 so that there would be no future checks on the back rank. After king g2 we have knight to c6 by black, rook to e1 by white. We have queen to b5 by black, so black wants the queen trade. but Magnus Carlsen denied the queen trade by playing queen b1. We have rook to c7, so Jan-Krzysztof Duda wants to double on the c file. So we have h4 by Magnus Carlsen. Yes, putting some pressure on Jan-Krzysztof Duda, because h4 is a very aggressive move. It tells the black that, okay, I'm going to attack on the king side. What are you going to do? Jan-Krzysztof Duda just simply ignored it and played rook to c8, just focusing on his plan. We have rook a2 by Magnus Carlsen. We have a5 by black. We have rook to h1, a4 by black. We have b4, so Magnus wants to block the position. We have h6 by Jan-Krzysztof Duda. Yeah, there would be no back rank mates anymore. We have bishop to e3 by white, protecting the pawn on d4. Knight to a7. We have bishop to d2. Now we have queen to e2. Rook to e1 by white, attacking the queen on e2. So we have queen to c4, and now there are triple on the c file. Yeah, very strong. Now we have rook to e3 by white, knight to b5, and after playing knight to b5, I think it's the best square for the knight on b5 on the whole board. Yeah, just attacking the pawn on a3 and also putting pressure on the d4 pawn. It's the best square. And also by playing knight b5, there are no more rook c3 ideas, because the knight on b5 is covering the c3 square. So after playing knight b5, we have rook to d3 by white, giving more protection to the pawn on d4, because the knight on b5 and the queen on c4 is attacking the pawn on d4. We have rook to c6 by black, rook to b2 by white, bishop to d8 by black, g4 by white, and after g4 it definitely looks like white is going to definitely break with g5 and perhaps going to attack the king on g8. We have bishop to b6. Jan-Krzysztof Duda is still ignoring the threat of g5 and also putting the pressure on the pawn on d4, yeah, because it is the only pawn on the whole board which is weak. So after playing bishop b6, we have bishop to e3 by white, yeah, just triple protecting the pawn on d4. We have knight to c3 by black, yeah, just coming up with the knight, attacking the queen on b1. So we have queen to f1 by white, queen to b5 by black, rook to c2, knight to e4, and yeah, putting the knight on e4 is also a very fine move, and yeah, it is the second best square for the knight. Yeah, very best square. Yeah, controls all the critical squares. Yeah, there is no hope for the rook on d3 to come on any of the squares anymore. And yeah, just knight on e4 is putting some pressure on the pawn on f2, and yeah, there are some the knight on e4 is also protecting the g5 square, which is very important. And yeah, the most important part, the knight on e4 is can't be attacked from any, yeah, just there are no light square bishop which can attack the knight on e4. So very nice square for the knight on e4. So after knight e4, we have rook into c6, rook trade, and now we have rook to d1 by white. Yeah, white wants to play rook c1 and just trade the rooks. We have rook to c4 by black, because the queen was hanging. Rook to c4. We have knight to d2 by white, asking for a knight trade, because obviously the knight on e4 is like super strong. But okay, black is having no more choices. We have to trade the knights. So we have a knight trade. White captured the knight with a rook. We have queen c6. So perhaps black wants to play rook c3, putting some pressure on the a3 pawn. We have queen e2 by white, rook to c3 by black, and after playing rook c3, the rook on c3 is putting pressure on the a3 pawn. And after playing rook c3, white played rook to a2, which was a blunder by Magnus Carlsen. At the place of becoming passive by playing rook a2, protecting the pawn on a3, a better move could be to play g5 in this position. The reason g5 is a much better move, after g5 we have hg5, hg5, and after playing hg5, if black tried to capture the pawn on a3, now we have a super strong move by white, which is rook to d1. And the idea of playing rook d1 in this position here is, your white is preparing to play rook h1 followed by queen to h5 and threatening a checkmate on h8, which would be super deadly for black. This is the reason there could be this move. But at the place of playing g5, we have rook a2 by Magnus, which was not a nice move, but okay, as it was a rapid game, both the player was in tremendous pressure at this point, so obviously they have to play fast. After playing rook a2, protecting the pawn on a3, we have bishop to d8 by black. Yeah, just covering this g5 spot and also hitting the pawn on h4. We have g5 by white, hg5, hg5, and now we have queen to c4 by black. Black wants the queen trade, definitely at any cost. And white is having no choice, he have to trade the queen, so the queen will also enter in the game and it will be super deadly for white. So we have a queen trade, and after capturing the queen, black is having choice. He can capture up with the queen rook, as well as he can capture up the queen with the pawn. In the game, we have d into c4. It is a perfectly fine move, but a better move could be to capture the queen with the rook. Yeah, but okay, we have d into c4 by Jan-Krzysztof Duda. It is also a pretty fine move. We have d5 by Magnus Carlsen, and yeah, d5 move according to Engine is very bad move. At the place of playing d5, Engine prefers to play something like g6. Yeah, just creating some weaknesses on the black pawn chain. But what I think here is playing d5 was a very nice choice practically. The reason, here after capturing the pawn, after capturing the queen on c4, here the black idea here is black wants to play bishop b6 followed by rook d3 and capture the pawn on d4. And if I talk about white, the white rook on a2 cannot move from the a file because the pawn is hanging on a3. So it is a very important point. And what Magnus wants, as he's white and he's having a bad position, he wants to preserve the bishops. Because if black will simply play rook d3 followed by bishop b6 and capture the pawn on d4, white have to trade the bishops. And once the bishops get traded, it's completely winning position for black. So the idea of Magnus Carlsen here is he wants to keep the bishops on the board so that there would be some drawish chances in the end game. So it was a very nice try. He played d5. We have e into d5. He sacrificed a pawn so that there is no bishop b6 possible in the future now. We have rook to d2 by Magnus Carlsen, hitting the pawn on d5. And after playing rook to d2, Jan-Krzysztof Duda played rook to d3, which was the blunder by Jan-Krzysztof Duda. At the place of playing rook d3, a better move at the place of playing rook d3 was to simply capture the pawn on a3. What I think here is, Jan-Krzysztof Duda definitely found this rook a3, but after capturing up the pawn on a3, he thought white would capture the pawn on d5 with the rook, and now the rook on d5 is attacking the bishop on d8, and there's the only single move which wins for black in this position, and all other moves just equalizes the position. Yeah, but I think he just thought that the rook on d5 is now attacking the bishop on d8 and he have to move the bishop and it's a drawish position. But at the place of moving the bishop, there was an intermediate move, which is rook to d3, a very important move. I think he just missed this move, because the idea of rook d3 here the rook is attacking the rook on d5 as well as protecting the bishop on d8. So obviously white cannot trade the rooks. It's completely winning position for black. So white have to play rook c5, hitting the pawn on c4, and black can simply play c3 and it's completely winning position for black. But this is what Magnus Carlsen wanted. Jan-Krzysztof Duda didn't capture the pawn on a3 and he played rook to d3, which was a mistake by him. We have rook trade by Magnus Carlsen, and now we have f4 by Magnus. We have king f8, king to f3. Definitely the idea of black here, black wants to come to e7, e6 and f5, and yep, just create some pressure on the pawns on e5, f4 and g5. But okay, white wants to put the king on e3. So yep, we have king e7 by black, bishop to c5 check by white. So we have king e6, king to e3, king f5, and now Magnus Carlsen simply captured the pawn on d3. And now we have g6 by Jan-Krzysztof Duda. All those who were thinking why black is not capturing the pawn on f4. Yeah, it is also hanging. The reason black cannot capture the pawn on f4 here is, if black tries to capture the pawn on f4, now there is now the position is equal actually, because now comes a very powerful move. Can you find it? All those who have found g6, congratulations, this is the winning, this is the drawish move. After g6, black is having choice. He can capture the pawn or he can push the pawn, yeah, because white is threatening to capture the pawn on f7. So the most obvious move, black will capture the pawn. After capturing the pawn, now white is going to push the pawn to e6, and yeah, he's going to push the e7, and black can't even stop it. So basically, black have to give the bishop for the pawn, and eventually it's a drawish position eventually, yeah, because black is going to push the pawn and the bishop have to sacrifice for the pawn, and yeah, it's a drawish position. That's why after king into d3, black cannot capture the pawn on f4. That's why Jan-Krzysztof first played g6, so that there would be no push in the future of g6, and now he can capture the pawn on f4. But now Magnus Carlsen simply protected the pawn on f4 by playing bishop e3, and now it's completely drawish position. We have bishop c7, but Jan-Krzysztof Duda still continued the game because he is having slight edge. So let's see, will he able to convert the position or not. We have b5 by Magnus Carlsen. Yeah, it requires a way more confidence because the pawn on b4 was perfect. Yeah, there is no weaknesses on the a3 pawn because the bishop on c7 cannot enter on the white's area. But Magnus played b5, and now there is a permanent weakness on the pawn on a3. So the idea of black here, black wants to play bishop d8 followed by bishop e7, attacking the pawn on a3. We have bishop d8 by Jan-Krzysztof Duda, king to d4, and now white king is getting in. Bishop to b6 check, and here white cannot capture the pawn because the bishop is hanging, so white have to go back to d3. We have bishop to d8, and now we have king to d4 by white. So Magnus Carlsen is ready for a draw, but we have a deny by Jan-Krzysztof Duda. He played bishop e7 and continued the game, attacking the pawn on a3. Bishop to c1 protecting the pawn on a3. King to e6 protecting the pawn on d5. Bishop b2. We have bishop to d8. Perhaps the threat is to play bishop to b6 check. Now the king entered to the c5. Now we have bishop a5. So luckily white cannot advance from the 5th rank because all the 6th rank is covered by the black pieces. So yeah, the king cannot enter anymore. After playing bishop a5, Magnus Carlsen played bishop c1, which was the last blunder in the game. And by playing bishop c1, it's now completely winning position for Jan-Krzysztof Duda. Still not easy, but yep, black is winning. At the place of playing bishop c1, the right move, the only move for white to draw the game here is to play bishop to d4 in this position. The reason after bishop d4 it's a draw, I think although both the players were in crucial time pressure, so obviously I think after bishop d4 Magnus Carlsen would be afraid of bishop to d2, but after bishop d2 yeah, it definitely looks dangerous as black is attacking the pawn on f4. But actually it's still a drawish game because white is going to play king to b6 attacking the pawn on b7. We have bishop into f4 capturing the pawn, king into b7. We have king to d7 by black. We have b6 by white. Actually it's winning for white. After b6 here, if black tries to capture the pawn on g5, we have king to a8. Now white wants to push the pawn, so the only move here is black have to play bishop to d8. But now we have b7 by white. Bishop c7 trying to block the pawn on b8, so that if the queen would be advanced, black will simply capture the pawn. But now white is going to play bishop b6, saying okay, you can capture the bishop, I'm going to make a queen and going to win the game. So obviously black cannot capture. So if black tries to capture the pawn on e5, still protecting the pawn, square on b8, now white is going to play bishop to a7. And the idea of bishop a7 here is here white wants to play bishop b8. So if black wants, black will play g5 trying to push, make a queen. all those who are thinking why not d4, after d4 white can simply capture the pawn on d4, and black cannot capture the bishop back because there is a queen being made. So yep, so if black tries to play g5 trying to advance his g pawn, now we have bishop to b8 by white. Now if there would be bishop trade, then white is the one who is going to make the queen first. So that's why it's not possible, so that there could be no bishop trade. So if black tries to move the bishop from this diagonal, then white is simply going to play bishop h2 and going to make a queen, and it's winning for white. But definitely it requires a very hard calculation. That's why finding bishop d4 was definitely not an easy task. So we have bishop c1 by Magnus Carlsen, and now Jan-Krzysztof Duda came up with his bishop by playing bishop c3. And after bishop c3 we have b6 by white. And now all those who were thinking why not king b6 entering with the king and capturing the pawn on b7, it's also not working, because if you try to come up with the king, now I'm going to play d4, pushing up the pawn. Now white will capture the pawn. We have d3, b6, and now we have d2 by black. So basically white have to give up the bishop for the pawn on d2 and try to make the b pawn queen. We have bishop into d2, bishop into d2, king to 8. Now only 2 moves are remaining to make a queen, but we have bishop into f4, b7, and now black is on the time to capture the pawn and protecting the pawn square on b8. So even if white tries to make a queen, black will simply capture the queen, and now black is having 3 pawns against 2 pawns, and black king is much further advanced. He's going to capture simply the pawn on g5 and going to push his f pawn or g pawn and going to win the game. So this was the whole idea. That is the reason. After bishop to c3, white cannot enter with the king to b6, so we have b6 by Magnus Carlsen. Now we have d4 by black, king to c4 so that black cannot push his d pawn. We have now king to d7. Now it's king job to come further to capture the pawn on b6. We have bishop to e3 by Magnus Carlsen, a very nice try by him. In this position, he's actually giving up the bishop on e3. Actually cannot capture the bishop on e3 because now it's white is the one who is winning the game, because white is going to capture the bishop, and after king c6, king d3, capture the pawn, and now white is going to push the pawn to f5. Very nice move. Yeah, you have to capture the pawn, or else white is simply going to push the pawn on e6. So okay, let's see both the variations. If black captures the pawn on f5, now white is going to play e6. Yeah, attacking the pawn on f7, so black have to capture, and now I'm having g6 and white is going to make a queen. I'm going to win the game. So if black doesn't capture the pawn on f5, if he tries to play something like king to c7, trying to bring the king, now I'm having a very powerful move, which is e6 in this position. Very hard to find, but it's tremendous. Yeah, it doesn't matter which pawn you're going to capture. If you try to capture the pawn on e6, I'm going to capture the pawn on g6, and my pawn is going to get queen very fast. And if you try to capture the pawn on f5, now I'm simply going to capture the pawn on f7. I'm going to make the queen on the next move. That is the reason you cannot capture the bishop on e3. Obviously Duda saw it and he played bishop to b2. Yeah, now he's threatening to capture the bishop on e3, and now he's also attacking the pawn on e3. So Magnus simply captured the pawn on d4. Now we have bishop into a3, bishop to e3 by white, bishop to b2 by black. Black wants to push his a pawn. Now we have king b4, a3, king b3, so that the black pawn cannot be advanced any further. We have king to e6 by black, king to a2 by white, king to d5 by black. Now white can do nothing, he can just repeat the move, but black is going to get enter in the game. And yeah, now we have bishop to d4 by black, hitting the pawn on b6, so white simply captured the pawn on a3. We have bishop into b6, king b4, bishop f7, bishop f2, and on the move number bishop f2, after move number 74, Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces resigned the game, and Jan-Krzysztof Duda with the black pieces won the game and have qualified for the finals to fight against Sergei Karyakin. And now both the players Sergei Karyakin and Duda have been qualified for the candidates, and the person who will win the candidates will fight against Magnus Carlsen for the World Chess Championship title. And the reason after bishop f2 Magnus Carlsen resigned the game the reason is simple. Here Duda is going to simply play bishop g3 on the next move and simply going to capture the pawn on f4 and going to capture all the 3 pawns, and black is having 2 pawns and going to win the game. Simple, that was the reason. But okay, a very tough match between Magnus Carlsen and Duda, and yeah, it's never easy to win against Magnus Carlsen, yeah, but he won it. Tremendous performance by Duda as well as Magnus Carlsen. So guys, if you like the game, then you can like to my video. If you are new to my channel, then you can subscribe to my channel. I'm going to come up with these new videos for you because there are so many interesting games happening over everywhere, so we are going to check every game. So till then, stay tuned and keep watching Chess Fights.